Hi, everybody, and welcome back to video number 3 in chapter 1. And I did want to mention one point about raising capital in a corporation. In the book, it had a very interesting case of Norwegian Cruise Lines during the COVID time. And during the COVID time, basically, if you were in that business, nobody was sailing with you. It was a disaster for a cruise line. Well, Norwegian was able to raise $2.2 billion to get them through that 1 year plus time frame till they could get back to making some money. And it basically saved the business, which otherwise wouldn't have made it had they been organized under other types of organizations. So I thought that was very interesting. And away we go. The concept questions for this chapter, they ask you what are the 3 forms of business organizations, and I think that's pretty easy. You're going to have sole proprietorships, partnerships, and corporations. And then they ask what are the primary advantages and disadvantages of sole proprietorships and partnerships? Well, the primary advantage um, is that the entity itself does not pay taxes. The partners or sole proprietorships do personally. But the disadvantage primarily is one of liability. Owners of sole proprietorships and partnerships have unlimited liability. And I think I throw one more in there, which is called reduced administrative costs. They don't need to contend with SOX or SEC reporting or any of that. Um, the next one they ask is what is the difference between a general and limited partnership? And you'll remember that general partners have full liability, where limited liability uh, partnerships can basically opt out of full liability or other uh, things, but a partnership must have at least one general partner that does absorb all the liability risk. Then the last question is why is the corporate form superior when it comes to raising cash? And I think by the Norwegian Cruise Line example, it's one of being able to raise money and a lot of it in the case of Norwegian Cruise Line. So that's the big advantage. And actually, um, so where you don't have the option of raising that much cash if you're in a sole proprietorship. Okay, um, so a more general goal then, when a firm has no traded stock, is maximizing the market value of existing owners' equity. I think that's a very good definition of corporate finance. Um, and goal does not imply the financial manager should take illegal or unethical actions to increase the value of the equity of the firm, although that is very tempting sometimes. Um, whereas, let's say it costs money to maintain your equipment. Well, that would reduce profits in the short term, right? So an unethical decision might be, hey, let's postpone that maintenance and try to maximize the profitability of the company immediately. Short run thinking versus long run thinking. On the other hand, as you might watch in Shark Tank sometimes, long range thinking can be valid too, but sometimes long range thinking is just a an excuse not to have profitability in the current period. So there's a trade-off there, of course. Sarbanes-Oxley, that was enacted in 2002. I'm not the biggest fan of Sarbanes-Oxley, but it was intended to produce and protect, I should say, investors from corporate abuse. The big ones were WorldCom and Enron, big problems in the early 2000s. I remember it quite well. And it was sad to see that. Unfortunately, the rest of us had to pay the penalty of having to deal with Sarbanes-Oxley. And Section 404 requires each company's annual report to have an assessment of the company's internal control structure and financial reporting. That's what I indicated to you when we did the 100 audits in a quarter, and it was reviewed by outside auditors, etc. One of the provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley was that officers of the corporation must review and sign annual reports. That may not sound like a big deal to you, but those officers were the chief financial officer and the chief executive officer. And if I, for example, were to knowingly mislead the outside auditors, I could be personally liable for that. Prior to Sarbanes-Oxley, that was not the case. Actually, I think that's a pretty good provision for corporations. The annual report must list any deficiencies that they find in internal controls. And you will remember internal controls from your accounting course, financial accounting course. Okay. The agency problem. There is a relationship, shall I say, between stockholders and management called the agency relationship. But before I get into that, I'm going to ask you some concept questions. What is the goal of financial management? And what that would be is that we would make decisions that help benefit the stockholders, the owners, right? And what are some of the shortcomings of the goal of profit management? Well, I always distill that down into short run thinking. As I mentioned, maybe you don't do your maintenance properly, or you take other actions that are not in the better interest of the corporation to maximize profitability in the short run. There's a number of them that if you're interested, you can join me for my tutoring sessions and we can go through that in a little more depth. And what would be you give as a definition of corporate finance? That's a lengthy question, and it's on page 5 of the textbook. And basically what that says, imagine that you were to start your own business. No matter what type you started, you would have to answer 3 questions. First one, what long-term investment should you take on? That is, what lines of business will you be in? What sorts of building machinery and equipment will you need? Number 2, where will you get the long-term financing to pay for that investment? Will you bring in other owners or perhaps borrow the money from the bank or other sources? Number 3, how will you manage your everyday financial activities, such as collecting from customers and paying your suppliers, right? So those are important decisions that we make in the business world. Okay, so we move on to the agency problem here. It is the possibility here that there is a conflict of interest between stockholders and the management of a firm. Agency costs refer to a cost of the conflict of interest between stockholders and management. We have indirect agency costs, which are just lost opportunities. And then we have direct agency costs that come in 2 forms. Number 1, corporate expenditures that benefits management but costs the stockholders. I love the example that they use here, luxurious and unneeded corporate jet. I have tried many times to financially justify corporate jets because I love to fly in corporate jets. When I worked for Gulfstream, we had a very nice situation where I had the use of the corporate jet, and we flew from Savannah, Georgia. We flew from Savannah to Atlanta, to directly to San Antonio. I held the meeting aboard the jet and flew home the same day. And I got home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which was unheard of for me. Pulled my car right up on the tarmac, right up to the airplane. What a beautiful and fun way it was to do business that way. But all those things said and done, I couldn't justify the cost of a corporate jet. Yeah, I saved time on that particular route because I would have had to spend 3 days on the road, one day to get there because you have to go from Savannah to Atlanta to Dallas to San Antonio, and then back the same way. That takes a whole day, and then I'd had to have at least some time to have my meeting. So in that particular case, it was really nice, but generally speaking, the corporate jets are very difficult, if not impossible, to justify. Then there's the expense that arises from the need to monitor management actions. Those are expenses that, in theory, shouldn't need to happen if you've got good managements going for you. Okay, so management compensation. Do managers act in the stockholders' interests? When I worked for Chrysler, my personal selfish interest was the highest possible salary. And so there's management will frequently have a significant economic incentive to increase the share value for two reasons. Sometimes managerial compensation is usually tied to financial performance, as it was at Chrysler, in general, and often to share value in particular. So you don't get your bonuses if the company's not doing well. And then managers who are successful in pursuing stockholder goals will be in greater demand in this labor market and thus command higher salaries. I think that's generally true. I could always tell the story and a true story, that in one company that I worked for, I made more money by myself than the entire company did for 10 years each year because of one good idea. And I'm happy to tell you about it if you want to come to tutoring. But control of the firm, the stockholders ultimately do have control of the firm. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. You feel like the board of directors and the chief executive officer does, but they do elect the board of directors, and who in turn hire and fire the managers. So existing management may be replaced by stockholders via proxy fights or takeovers. What a proxy is, if you have stock, let's say in General Motors, they will send you a little proxy that says, please vote for our slate of management or officers that we think best run the company. And so you can take and vote your shares. It's not one person, one vote. It's how many shares of stock you have. So if you have 5 shares of stock, you get 5 votes. And you can choose to uh, um, agree with that proxy and sign off on it, or submit yourself as the chief executive officer. In any event, that's what would happen. But in a proxy fight, sometimes a group of stockholders will get together and try to gang up on the existing uh, um, people and try to take it over. That looks like a good place for us to end this video.